What's up, guys? My name's Brandon, and welcome back to Apple Weekly. So this week, Apple dropped iOS 26.2 RC just ahead of the final public release, which should be coming hopefully next week. So in this episode, we're going to discuss more about that, along with why there might be pre-installed state security software on some iPhones, 2 major losses at Apple, why FaceTime is being banned in some countries, a crazy AirTag story, and more. Okay, so before we talk about iOS 26.2, let's first start with how the EU might be changing even more Apple applications, more specifically the Apple Maps application, along with Apple Ads. And that's because the EU is now targeting those applications, because if you guys remember, 2 years ago, the App Store, iOS, and Safari were classified as gatekeepers, which led to Apple allowing those alternative App Store marketplaces and third-party payment options in the EU. And now the EU is looking into whether Apple Maps and Apple Ads should be designated as gatekeepers and subject to greater regulation. And the reason they're only doing this now is because Apple Maps and Apple Ads finally hit the threshold that mandates a review. So as of now, the regulators have about 45 working days to decide, and then after that, Apple will have 6 months to comply. So not too sure how Apple Maps and Apple Ads would change, but we could be seeing some pretty big changes coming to those applications, specifically in the EU. Now, also this week, the Indian government ordered Apple and other smartphone manufacturers to pre-install a state-owned security application on all phones before they're sold to users. Now, Apple instantly pushed back on this and said that they would not comply with the mandate. However, you can see that the app here is called Sanchar Sathi, or Communication Partner, and the app is intended to track stolen phones, block them, and prevent them from being misused. And the government also wants manufacturers to ensure that the app is not disabled. So I don't see any world where this actually happens, and that's why Apple, of course, did push back on this, but it is still interesting nonetheless that the Indian government is trying to get something like this passed and on our iPhones. Now, of course, it's not just for iPhones. They did also issue this to Samsung and Xiaomi, and they wanted them to preload their phones with this application. So it'll be interesting to see how much harder India tries to push this onto, Apple to put on our devices, which again, I don't think it's going to happen, but it is interesting to note that it is a possibility at least. And in related news, we also saw this week that Russia completely blocked FaceTime on all Apple devices. And this is because Russia is claiming that FaceTime is being used for criminal activity and that blocking the app is a legitimate law enforcement measure. Now let's talk about some of the biggest news, perhaps of the year, that happened at Apple this week. And that is that Apple's VP of Human Interface Design, Alan Dye, has left Apple for Meta. This is huge news, and Bloomberg were the ones who broke this, and they said this: Meta has poached Apple's most prominent design executive in a major coup that underscores a push into AI-equipped consumer devices. The company is hiring Alan Dye, who has served as the head of Apple's user interface design team since 2015. Apple is replacing Dye with longtime designer Stephen LeMay. Dye most recently oversaw the interface of the Vision Pro headsets and a sweeping redesign of Apple's operating systems, aka Liquid Glass. He was also central to designing the company's apps, the Apple Watch, and the iPhone X. And man, just the knowledge of Vision OS and the whole Vision Pro headset that Meta is going to gain by, getting Dye on their team, it could be huge for the future of, Meta's headsets. Also, Zuckerberg took to Threads to announce that Meta will be launching a new creative studio in Reality Labs that's led by Alan Dye. And Mark Gurman said this over on X: the many people happy about Alan Dye leaving Apple are missing the bigger point. He was Apple's head of design, and he left to run design at maybe Apple's primary competitor. That is the enormous development. Apple is losing top people like it hasn't in 30 years. This is a guy Apple would never have gotten rid of, no matter what anyone on here thinks about Liquid Glass. And here was my initial take on X when this news first broke. I said, oof, another big loss for Apple. And then I followed up by saying, I think it's good that Apple is moving on from Dye, who's been there forever. It's a big name to lose, but his replacement could go on to be better for the future of Apple and give it a fresh vision. I'm excited to see how all of these internal shifts will fare for Apple over the next decade plus. And I fully stand by that. I really think that this is, obviously nobody lasts forever at these roles. So I'm pretty excited to see what's to come with the change. Also, Steve LeMay, who is the new head of design now at Apple, is a veteran. Like, he's been there since 1999, and he was part of the original iPhone software design team. Now, he's also been involved in the development of macOS, iPadOS, watchOS, and visionOS, so he knows a thing or two about design and Apple software. And by the way, many people inside and outside of Apple seem to be kind of happy about this move, at least according to John Gruber, who said this: "I've chatted with people with criticisms of specific things LeMay has worked on or led at Apple, but everyone I've spoken to is happy, if not downright giddy, at the news that LeMay is replacing Dye. LeMay is well liked personally and deeply respected talent-wise," said one source in a position to know the choices. "I don't think there was a better choice than LeMay." And even ex-Apple employees are quite excited to see LeMay in this role. One on X saying this: "Steve LeMay is by far the best designer I've ever met or worked with in my entire life. Literally taught me what design is. Incredibly exciting for Apple." So yeah, I guess there's kind of two ways that you can take this. You can see it as a veteran leaving who's been there for a long time and really led, the pack with, liquid glass and things like that. But also we see Steve LeMay, who's well respected and also been there for a very long time, since 1999. So he knows a thing or two, and he could bring some fresh visions to Apple. And it seems like that's a better fit for him as well, at least according to a lot of people with a lot more insight on this than I do, especially people inside of Apple. So I'm really excited to see, what this brings for the future of Apple. And also this week we saw another big loss for Apple, and that is John G., Apple's VP of AI. So he's retiring, presumably because of these Siri delays. Maybe not entirely, but Apple did announce this on their newsroom, and they said he's retiring in the spring, and former Microsoft AI researcher Amar S. will take over as VP of AI at Apple. And he's now going to lead Apple's foundation models, ML research, and AI safety and evaluation, and he's going to report to Craig Federighi. And Mark Gurman had this to say about it. He said, "Strange hire for a number of reasons, but it's hard to argue the Apple job is a bad one. Anything is an improvement at this point, so the bar is as low as it comes. Easy layup on the resume." Now, we also got some interesting news this week about Apple and Intel forming a partnership again. So this is actually pretty interesting because, as you know, all Macs are now powered by Apple's, custom designed M series chips, but now it's being rumored that Apple might rekindle the partnership with Intel for work on those Mac chips. And this also comes from Ming-Chi Kuo. So he said that Intel is expected to begin shipping Apple's lowest end M series chip as early as mid-2027. And Apple plans to utilize Intel's 18A process, which is the earliest available sub-2 nanometer advanced node manufactured in North America. And if this turns out to be true, Intel would manufacture the M6 or the M7 chips for the MacBook Air, iPad Air, and iPad Pro, while TSMC would continue to supply the majority of Apple's M series chips. Now, why is Apple going this route, and why are they doing this for the lowest end chips only? Well, it could be political reasons, because Ming-Chi Kuo is also saying that Apple is choosing to have Intel supply the lowest end M chip, and that would appease the Trump administration's desire for made in USA products, while also helping Apple diversify its supply chain for manufacturing. And if you have an original iPhone SE, Apple is now classifying that as obsolete. So that is something interesting to note if you do have that original SE. Now, also this week, YouTube launched their 2025 recap. So if you're curious to see your top viewed channels and your videos and the categories that you watched, just go into the U tab over on the YouTube application, and you can see right here, it says your 2025 recap is here. If you tap on that, it will show you details about what you've watched, and you will get some music playing with it as well. You can see my top interests are right here: latest tech gadgets, sneaker culture, car reviews, and so on. And you can see all the channels I've watched right there, and you can see my top channels here as well. So if you guys had me as one of your top channels, let me know in a comment down below. I'm really curious. A lot of you guys over on X did share that with me and showed me that you were, one of my, or I guess you were, one of the top viewers, I guess, like the top 1% of viewers or whatever. So if you had that, feel free to send it to me over on X or on Instagram. I really love seeing that, and I really appreciate you guys for the support. But I thought this was kind of cool. It's kind of like Spotify Wrapped or Apple Music's Replay, which, by the way, that leads me right to Apple Music, because also if you go into Apple Music and go to the home page right here, you will see your replay right up top. It says replay your music story is here. Now, if you go ahead and tap on that, it will show you your replay right here. It shows 2025, and you can watch the highlight reel. You can also scroll down to see your top artists of the year. So you can see my top artists along with the minutes right there for each of them. It also shows my top songs of 2025 right here. Also my top albums. So you can see Bieber on top with my top albums of the year, along with top playlists, top stations, and top genres. So feel free if you do have an Apple Music subscription. I know Spotify does have Spotify Wrapped as well, but I think that Apple's replay is really solid. And of course you can go month by month on this as well and see, who you listen to or what you listen to the most on a month by month basis, or you can just go to 2025 and you can click on this and watch the highlight reel of everything you listen to this year. So pretty cool. Now, something that's not really cool is the fact that Netflix has now removed the ability to cast movies or TV shows to your TV unless you have like a Chromecast or an old TV where you have the Google Cast feature. But now Netflix has removed the ability to cast shows from your phone to the TV, which is quite annoying. We also got some fresh new games for the month for Apple Arcade. So if you are an Apple Arcade subscriber, there were 5 new games added for this month, including Subway Surfers, the most downloaded mobile game of all time, right there, along with SpongeBob Patty Pursuit 2, Power Wash Simulator, Cult of the Lamb, and a Naruto game. So all of those have been added to Apple Arcade if you are a subscriber. Okay, so now let's talk about iOS 26.2 RC. So we did see the release candidate get released this week for both developers and for public beta testers. Now, like I mentioned in that video, which by the way, I hope you guys are thankful that I'm using a different wallpaper. A lot of people were really mad at the wallpaper I used in that video. So I don't know, it turned out worse on camera, I guess, than it looks like in real life. But that's besides the point. I'm using a much more calm, wallpaper this time around. But anyways, as I mentioned in that video, we are most likely going to see an RC2 before the final release of iOS 26.2, at least if Apple sticks to what they did last year with iOS 18.2. So if that's the case, we should be seeing RC2 next week and then the final the week after. So if I go into the calendar right here, you can see that next week is the week of December 8th, and we should be seeing the second RC most likely on the 8th with a final public release of iOS 26.2, most likely on Wednesday the 10th, if Apple follows what they've done in the past. That seems like the most likely scenario. At the very latest, it would be the following week on the week of December 15th, but that could very well be when we see iOS 26.3 beta 1 go out and no, official public releases that week. But we'll have to wait and see. That is just what we're thinking right now. But as far as iOS 26.2 RC, like I mentioned in that video, it feels pretty much the exact same as the previous beta for me. It feels the same as beta 3. Now I did run a Geekbench test, so I ran another one here. We scored a 97.24, so even lower than, what we ran initially. So you can see that right there. And again, like I mentioned in last week's Apple Weekly episode, we scored over 10,000 on the multi-core. So that's going to be hard to top, and you can see I got even less this time around. I guess single core was higher, but multi-core was lower, which is quite interesting. But so far, battery life, performance feels about the same as the previous beta for me, which isn't a bad thing because they've been pretty good for me. And I've really had no issues with battery drain or anything like that. But if you guys have had a different experience, please let me know down in the comments below. I'm really curious. And I should also mention that people were saying that CarPlay was fixed with the RC build. I know I mentioned it in my What's New video, but it's more of like a it should be fixed type thing. But now we've had confirmation from a couple of people that a lot of the CarPlay issues have been resolved. Now, not all of them. Some people are still going to have issues with CarPlay because there's a lot of variables with that, but it seems like the majority of people with the reboot issues have had that resolved. And then finally, just as tradition, we have another crazy AirTag story. So this time, a family in California was watching a football game at their vacation home when their dog Sadie, which is a black lab mix, decided to go off on a little adventure. Now they didn't realize that she had slipped out until she was gone, and they searched the neighborhood but could not find her anywhere. Now what they didn't know was that Sadie had made it all the way to Ocean Beach and had been swept into a rip current. So a surfer in the area spotted the dog struggling in the Mission Bay Channel and quickly alerted lifeguards, which kicked off a full-scale rescue. Lifeguards launched jet skis, the US Coast Guard joined in even, and there was a search that went on for over an hour for Sadie. But after over an hour of everybody searching, there was still no sign of her, so the search was called off. But just as crews were turning back around, Jet Ski 2 spotted something moving in the water about a half-mile offshore, and it was Sadie. So they were able to pull her out, they got her into a surf boat and brought her back to shore where her family was waiting. And turns out Sadie was wearing an AirTag this whole time, and that's how her owners were able to track her across nearly 2 miles of coastline to the general area where she was finally rescued. So I guess they were giving directions to the Coast Guard and kind of telling them the general area where where their dog was out in the water. And lifeguard said they just wanted a happy ending, and thanks to the AirTag, they got a happy ending. So that is pretty crazy. That is definitely a first for an AirTag story here on the channel, and I'd love to see the great result there. So even if you have a dog, like I've said before, it is worth putting it on their leash, just especially if you have water nearby, just in case of something crazy like that happening. This dog may not have survived if it were not for the AirTag and for the owners being able to tell the Coast Guard and everybody, the general direction of their dog, thanks to the Find My application showing it. But anyways, guys, there you have it. That is this week's episode of Apple Weekly. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Also, let me know all your thoughts about everything down in the comment section below. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.